on findings being published in a new book out today on the Shroud of Turin. That's the linen cloth believed to bear Jesus' imprint as he was being prepared for burial. And now there's new research that may disprove the claim of people who've said it's an elaborate fake.
He was wrapped in linen, and then his body was put in the tomb.
In 1978, a Jewish photographer walked into a cathedral in Turin, Italy, expecting to debunk the most famous relic in Christianity. His name was Barry Schwartz. Born in Pittsburgh, raised in a strict Orthodox Jewish home with 2 sets of dishes, 2 sets of silverware, grandparents in the house, and a bar mitzvah at 13. He wasn't religious anymore, hadn't thought about God in years, and he had zero interest in Jesus Christ, the resurrection, or any relic associated with either. But Schwartz was one of the best scientific photographers in America. And when a team of 33 scientists assembled to examine the Shroud of Turin, the 14-foot linen cloth that millions believe wrapped the body of Jesus after crucifixion, they needed a photographer without bias. No agenda, no emotional attachment, just the lens and the data. Schwartz tried to quit twice. He told the team leader, "Why would a Jewish man want to get involved with what is probably the most important relic in Christianity?" A NASA imaging scientist named Don Lin looked at him and said, "Have you forgotten that the man in question was also a Jew?" Then added 5 words that would define the next 46 years of Schwartz's life. God doesn't tell us in advance. He went to Turin expecting to see paint, expecting brushstrokes. Within the first hour of examining the cloth, he knew it wasn't a painting, but he still didn't believe it was real, because there was one thing about the shroud that made no sense, one detail that kept him skeptical for 17 more years. The blood on the cloth was red, not brown, not black, not the color every forensic scientist will tell you ancient blood turns after decades, let alone centuries. Red. Standing over that cloth in 1978, Schwartz looked at his colleague Vern Miller, and they both shook their heads. They could see the doubt in each other's eyes. Old blood doesn't stay red. Something was wrong. It would take 17 years, a phone call from a dying Jewish blood chemist, and a single word, bilirubin, to break Barry Schwartz's resistance and force him to accept what the evidence had been telling him all along. That phone call is coming, but not yet. Because the story of the Shroud doesn't begin with Schwartz. It begins in a dark room in 1898 with a man who nearly dropped a priceless glass plate when he saw what appeared on it, because the face staring back at him from the negative was impossible. May 28, 1898, the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin. An amateur photographer named Secondo Pia has been granted rare permission by King Umberto I to photograph the Shroud during a royal exhibition. Photography in 1898 is brutal. No digital sensors, no preview screens. Pia hauls a camera the size of a suitcase onto scaffolding inside the cathedral, uses violent magnesium flashes, and exposes 2 massive glass plates, each about 20 by 24 inches. Late that night, alone in his dark room, lit only by the faint red glow of a safety lamp, Pia lowers a plate into developing chemicals, and as the image materializes on the glass, he nearly drops it. On a photographic negative, everything reverses. Light becomes dark, dark becomes light. Faces become ghoulish, distorted, flat masks with hollow eyes. That's the fundamental law. The Shroud broke it. What appeared was not a distortion. It was a portrait, a sharp, detailed, hauntingly realistic face. Eyes gently closed, broken nose, bruising along the right cheek, a mustache, a forked beard, an expression of devastating calm on someone who'd endured extreme suffering. It looked like a photograph of a real human being taken centuries before photography existed. Here's what this means. The image on the cloth itself is already a negative. A negative of a negative becomes a positive. And that positive image hidden inside the tonal reversal for centuries is anatomically accurate, proportionally correct, and detailed beyond anything any known artistic method can explain. Now ask the question that shattered a century of easy dismissal. Who in the medieval world, 800 years before photography, understood the concept of a photographic negative? Who could create a flawless reversed image across 14 feet of linen without any way to see, test, or verify the result? The human eye cannot perceive the world in negative. The human brain cannot compose an image in reversed tonal values. No medieval artist had any reason to attempt this. No modern artist has successfully replicated it. That single photograph was the first crack in the wall. The Shroud didn't behave like a painting. It behaved like something without a name. For 78 years, that anomaly sat unanswered. Then, in 1976, two Air Force physicists pointed a machine built for mapping Mars at the image, and the question got much worse. February 1976, Air Force Academy, Colorado Springs. Physicists John Jackson and Eric Jumper fed a photograph of the Shroud into a VP-8 image analyzer, a Cold War device that converts image brightness into three-dimensional terrain relief built for mapping planetary surfaces from satellite data. You feed it a flat image, bright areas rise, dark areas sink, and it generates a topographic model. They'd already tested dozens of images, paintings, photographs, sketches, X-rays. Everyone produced meaningless garbage, distorted blobs with no spatial coherence. Because in a normal image, brightness represents reflected light, not distance. A bright spot on a face doesn't mean that part of the face is physically closer. It means the light hit it at a certain angle. The VP-8 can't translate that into meaningful three-dimensional data. The Shroud produced a perfect three-dimensional human body. Peter Schumacher, the engineer who built the VP-8, had never heard of the Shroud. No religious background, no stake in the outcome. His account, the results were unlike anything he had ever processed through the analyzer before or since. A geometrically accurate form. Nose, cheekbones, brow ridge, chest, crossed hands, legs, all contoured correctly, rotatable without distortion. Image intensity at every point corresponded precisely to the distance between the body and the cloth, not reflected light. Three-dimensional spatial data encoded into ancient linen. In nearly 50 years since, no image painted, photographed, or digitally generated has ever reproduced this result. Not one. Only about 60 VP-8 units were ever built. Only 2 still work. And the question remains, how do you encode distance information into fabric without any technology that existed before the 20th century? If you're already asking how that's possible, the evidence keeps building because the image was strange. But the blood was something else entirely. While many dismissed the idea that the Shroud is evidence of a miracle, they can't explain how the image was made. This is not a very simple technique that was available in the Middle Ages and required no technologies, no strange theories or equipment. Remember Schwartz standing over the Shroud in 1978, staring at bloodstains that were the wrong color? He wasn't alone. The full STURP team, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, 33 scientists from Los Alamos, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Air Force Academy spent 120 continuous hours examining the cloth. They ran X-ray fluorescence, infrared spectroscopy, ultraviolet photography, and microchemical analysis. When they finished, chemists John Heller and Alan Adler performed 12 diagnostic tests on blood samples. Heller's reaction when the spectral curve confirmed hemoglobin. The hair stood up on the back of his neck. Real blood, not paint, not ochre. They confirmed hemoglobin, albumin, porphyrin derivatives. They found serum halos, the pale rings that form when blood separates as it dries. Halos no medieval painter would think to reproduce because the phenomenon wasn't understood until modern forensics. And here's a detail that eliminates every forgery theory in one stroke. The blood was on the cloth before the image formed. Underneath the blood stains, there is no body image. None. Blood first, image second. A forger paints the body first, adds blood on top. Every artist in history works that way. The Shroud does it backwards. That sequence alone eliminates painting, rubbing, printing, and every contact transfer method ever proposed. But the blood told a darker story. In 2017, researchers at the University of Padua examined shroud blood fibers at the atomic level using transmission electron microscopy. They found creatinine nanoparticles at concentrations that only appear in one clinical scenario: rhabdomyolysis, the systematic destruction of skeletal muscle from prolonged extreme torture. The person whose blood is on this cloth was beaten to a state where his muscles were dissolving into his bloodstream before the crucifixion even began. That matches the Roman practice of scourging with the flagrum, leather whips embedded with lead weights and bone fragments. The shroud shows over 100 scourge marks consistent with two soldiers striking from alternating sides. Now, I need to be honest here. The 2017 study was retracted by the journal in 2018. Procedural issues, not fabrication. The underlying observations are consistent with Heller and Adler's independent findings from decades earlier. But a retracted paper is a retracted paper. We tell you where the evidence is strong and where it's contested. That's the deal. The nail wounds are through the wrists, not the palms. Every painting of the crucifixion you've ever seen, Giotto, Michelangelo, Rubens, shows nails through the palms. But in the 1930s, French surgeon Pierre Barbet drove nails through cadaver hands and proved palm tissue cannot support a body's weight. The nails tear through. Crucifixion requires nailing through the space between the wrist bones that can bear the full load. And every time Barbet nailed through that space, the same thing happened. The median nerve was damaged, and the thumb snapped violently inward against the palm. Barbet described it precisely. The contraction was immediate and violent, forcing the thumb into a position it could never return from once rigor mortis set in. Look at the shroud. Count the fingers on each hand. 4, not 5. The thumbs are tucked into the palms, invisible from the back of the hand. Exactly what happens when a nail destroys the median nerve. No medieval artist knew this. No one knew this until modern anatomy demonstrated it. Every crucifixion painting in history gets this detail wrong. The shroud gets it right. Before this, did you think the nails went through the palms? Because every painting you've ever seen told you they did. The shroud says otherwise. Drop your answer in the comments, palms or wrists, and tell me if this is the first time you're hearing this. And then there's the blood type AB. One of the rarest in the world, about 3% of the global population. That same blood type appears on a completely separate cloth, one with a story that should give every skeptic serious pause. In the Cathedral of San Salvador in the city of Oviedo in northern Spain, there is another cloth, smaller, about 33 by 21 inches. No image on it, just blood and fluid stains. It's called the Sudarium of Oviedo, the face cloth. Its documented history traces to at least 570 CE, with a recorded journey from Jerusalem in 614 CE fleeing the Persian invasion. And here's a detail that puts this in perspective. On March 14, 1075, the chest containing the Sudarium was officially opened in a ceremony witnessed by King Alfonso VI of Spain, and standing beside him was Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, the man history knows as El Cid, one of the most documented figures of the medieval period. That's not legend. That's a recorded historical event with named witnesses. Two cloths, two countries, two completely separate chains of custody, one in Turin, one in northern Spain. They have never been in the same room, and yet blood type AB on both. stain patterns that match the face dimensions on the shroud. When overlaid using polarized image technology, researchers found 70 points of coincidence on the front and 50 on the back. Calculated nose length from fluid flow about 3 inches identical to the shroud. Thorn puncture wounds on the back of the head align perfectly. If these two cloths covered the same face and the forensic overlap is extraordinary, then the sudarium, with its documented existence centuries before the carbon date, independently proves the shroud cannot be a medieval forgery because you'd need to forge both in 2 countries with matching blood types, matching wound patterns, matching anatomical dimensions. Before the invention of forensic science, the blood tells you how this man died. The DNA tells you something different, something nobody expected. It tells you where this cloth has been. In 2015, geneticist John Barcacha published a study in Nature Scientific Reports. His team extracted dust from deep within the shroud's weave and sequenced the mitochondrial DNA. If the shroud was a French forgery from 1350, European DNA should dominate. If it was a Jerusalem relic that never traveled, Middle Eastern DNA should dominate. Neither happened. Genetic fingerprints from across the world. Haplogroup H33 found almost exclusively among the Druze, a tightly isolated ethno-religious community in the mountains of Israel, Lebanon, and Syria, whose DNA has remained virtually unchanged for thousands of years. Western European haplogroups consistent with centuries of handling by French and Italian clergy. Haplogroup L3 East Africa, possibly Egypt or Ethiopia. M39, M56 Rat, the Indian subcontinent. D4, G2, East Asia, China, India, Africa, Europe, the Middle East, all encoded in the dust of one cloth. A forger in 14th century, France couldn't have collected biological traces from 5 continents. Marco Polo had only recently returned. There were no trade networks capable of depositing genetically identifiable material from that many populations onto one piece of fabric unless the cloth wasn't forged in France, unless it had traveled. According to Byzantine, Syrian, and Arabic sources, the shroud spent centuries folded to show only the face known as the image of Edessa, or the Mandylion. Its journey, Jerusalem to Edessa, a major crossroads on the Silk Road where caravans from China, India, Persia, and Arabia converged. From Edessa to Constantinople, the Byzantine capital, a megacity where every civilization met, traded, and venerated relics. Every kiss, every touch, every breath left behind microscopic traces. After the Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople in 1204, the cloth disappeared. It resurfaced in France around 1353. The DNA is not random contamination. It is a biological passport, a 2,000-year travel log written in molecules, and the pollen confirmed it. Swiss criminologist Max Frey and Israeli botanist Avinoam Danon identified pollen from 58 plant species on the cloth. 17 European expected, but the majority came from the Middle East, Turkey, and a narrow corridor between Jerusalem and Jericho. One plant dominated, Gundelia tournefortii, a thorny desert thistle with long, needle-like spines. Its pollen made up nearly a third of all grains, concentrated heavily around the head area. It blooms near Jerusalem in early spring, the season of Passover, a crown of thorns written in pollen, invisible for 2,000 years. The DNA mapped the journey. The pollen confirmed the route. The blood described a death by sustained torture. But one test supposedly settled the debate decades ago, and it said the opposite until one chemist at Los Alamos decided to look closer. 1988, 3 elite radiocarbon laboratories, the University of Arizona, the University of Oxford, and ETH Zurich, each received samples cut from the shroud on April 21. The test was supposed to end the debate forever. The results, 1260 to 1390 CE. Medieval 95% confidence. Published in Nature, the most respected scientific journal in the world. Headlines everywhere. Case closed. On October 13, 1988, Oxford's Professor Edward Hall stood before a blackboard on which he'd scrawled 1260 to 1390 with an exclamation mark. He told reporters that someone had simply gotten a bit of linen, faked it up, and flogged it. He compared people who believed in the Shroud to flat earthers. And then something happened that should trouble anyone who cares about scientific integrity. Shortly after the announcement, 45 wealthy donors contributed £1 million to endow a new chair at Oxford, the Edward Hall Chair of Archaeological Sciences. And the first person appointed to that endowed position was Dr. Michael Tite, the very British Museum official who had supervised the carbon dating test, the man who oversaw the protocol, handled the samples, managed communications between labs, rewarded with an endowed chair funded by donors who celebrated the result. That's not proof of misconduct, but it's the kind of institutional entanglement that in any other field would trigger serious questions about conflicts of interest. The Church stepped back. Pope John Paul II quietly reclassified the Shroud from a relic to an icon. The scientific community moved on, but the test had a problem, a structural problem visible from the beginning. The original 1986 protocol called for 7 laboratories, multiple sample sites from different areas of the cloth. Blind testing supervised by 3 independent institutions. By the time the Vatican finished negotiating, the protocol was gutted. 3 labs, 1 sample site, 1 supervisor, the British Museum. The blind test was abandoned because the Shroud's distinctive herringbone weave was instantly identifiable. That single sample came from the most handled corner of the entire cloth, the very edge bishops and cardinals had gripped during public exhibitions for centuries. Soaked in sweat, candle wax, incense smoke, and the oils of 1,000 hands. Enter Raymond Rogers. Rogers was not a believer. He was a fellow at Los Alamos National Laboratory, one of the most elite scientific institutions on Earth. He'd been Stirp's lead chemist in 1978. He was a founding editor of Thermochimica Acta, a major peer-reviewed chemistry journal. When 2 researchers published a 2000 paper suggesting the carbon-dated sample came from a medieval repair patch, Rogers called their theory ludicrous. He set out to disprove it. Then he examined the actual threads, comparing fibers from the carbon-dated corner with threads from other areas of the cloth, threads he'd personally collected in 1978. Rogers found completely different chemical and physical properties. The carbon-dated sample contained cotton Gossypium herbaceum, a Near Eastern variety interwoven with the linen. Cotton completely absent from the rest of the Shroud. The sample was coated with yellow-brown plant gum containing alizarin dye from madder root bonded with gum arabic, materials found nowhere else on the cloth. The medieval nuns who repaired the Shroud after a catastrophic fire in 1532 hadn't just patched the edges. They had expertly woven new cotton threads into the original linen, dyed to match the aged color, bonded with gum to make the repair invisible. And the 3 most prestigious radiocarbon labs in the world had dated the patch, not the Shroud. Rogers published in Thermochimica Acta, January 2005. His conclusion was blunt. The radiocarbon sample was not part of the original cloth. The date was not valid. His vanillin analysis measuring a compound that degrades in linen over centuries showed the main Shroud had 0 vanillin matching the Dead Sea Scrolls. The carbon-dated corner still retained vanillin. His age estimate for the original cloth between 1,300 and 3,000 years old. Raymond Rogers died on March 8, 2005, 2 months after publication. But here's what nobody tells you, the part that should genuinely make you angry. For 30 years after the 1988 test, the laboratories refused to release their raw data. The most important archaeological test in modern history and the underlying measurements were locked away. Researchers who requested the numbers were denied. Freedom of information requests were deflected for 3 decades. Then in 2017, French researcher Tristan Casabianca, a law graduate, not a scientist, used British Freedom of Information law to prize 711 pages of raw data from the British Museum. What he found and published in 2019 in Archaeometry, a journal founded by Edward Hall himself at Oxford, was devastating. Arizona alone had made 40 individual measurements, not the 4 summarized in the original Nature paper. The data was not statistically homogeneous. Different parts of the same tiny sample gave radiocarbon ages varying by 150 years across just about an inch. The overall agreement index was 28%, catastrophically low for a test claiming 95% confidence. Oxford's measurements had been manually aggregated and their error bars adjusted upward. The debunking wasn't debunked, but it was exposed as built on contaminated, repaired material with data that didn't hold together statistically. And then in 2022, Italian physicist Liberato De Caro offered a different dating method entirely, one that bypasses organic contaminants. Wide-angle X-ray scattering measures how cellulose in linen fibers degrades at the atomic level over centuries. De Caro compared the Shroud's fibers against fabrics of known ages, Egyptian mummy wrappings, medieval textiles, and linen from the Jewish fortress of Masada, destroyed by Romans in 73 CE and never reoccupied. The Shroud cellulose matched Masada 1st century, and textile conservator Mechthild Fleury-Lemberg, with 30 years as head of the Abegg Foundation, one of Europe's most prestigious textile institutions, examined the Shroud's reverse side and found a stitching technique she'd encountered only once before in 40 years on textiles from Masada pre-73 CE definitively. I'm curious, did you think the Shroud was debunked? Most people do. The 1988 headlines were everywhere. The correction barely made the news. Let me know in the comments. Is this the first time you're hearing the carbon dating was flawed? Because if it is, ask yourself why nobody told you. If what you've heard has made you question what settled science really means. We dig into the cases everyone thinks are closed. Because we're not done. Everything so far is remarkable. But the deepest mystery isn't the blood, the DNA, or the dating. It's the image itself, how it was made. And after 40 years of trying, no laboratory on Earth can answer that question. Here's what the Shroud image is not: paint. STURP tested every centimeter. Their 1981 conclusion drafted after 3 years of peer review. No pigments, paints, dyes, or stains have been found on the fibrils. Not a scorch from a heated statue. Thermal burns fluoresce under UV light. The body image doesn't. Different chemistry entirely. Not a photograph. It encodes 3-dimensional data no photograph can produce. Not a vapor transfer. Those create blurred, directionless stains. The image exists only on the topmost 200 nanometers of the linen fibers, thinner than a bacterium. It's a chemical change, oxidation, and dehydration of the cellulose in the fiber's outermost layer. The atoms in the fibers have been rearranged, not coated. Each individual fiber is either colored or not, a binary halftone effect like the dots in a newspaper photograph. Image density comes from the number of colored fibers per unit area, not from gradation within individual fibers. No brush strokes, no directionality, no capillary flow, meaning no liquid was ever involved, and it exists only on the front and back surfaces of the cloth, not on the body's sides, not on the top of the head, as if the encoding mechanism operated strictly vertically. STURP's final report included an admission you almost never see in scientific literature. They wrote that some explanations, which might be tenable from a chemical point of view, were precluded by the physics, and certain physical explanations which might be attractive were completely precluded by the chemistry. The question of how the image was produced remains now, as it has in the past, a mystery. That was 1981. Since then, Italy's ENIA laboratory, the National Agency for New Technologies, spent 5 years trying to replicate the image. Physicist Paolo Di Lazzaro and his team irradiated linen with excimer lasers at 193 nanometers deep vacuum ultraviolet. They achieved superficial coloration on tiny patches that resembled the shroud's characteristics. But to reproduce the full-body image covering approximately 2,600 square inches, their calculations required a simultaneous energy pulse of 34 trillion watts, lasting less than a billionth of a second, powerful enough to alter the chemistry of the cloth surface, yet precise enough not to burn the fibers beneath. No technology on Earth can produce that pulse. Di Lazzaro was direct. Their research proved it was almost impossible to replicate all the main characteristics of the body image using any technology available in the Middle Ages or earlier or later. Filmmaker David Rolfe has offered a standing $1 million prize to anyone who can replicate the Shroud image with all its properties. The challenge remains unclaimed. And then there's the fire. The detail almost no video about the Shroud gives proper weight. On the night of December 3, 1532, fire engulfed the Sainte-Chapelle in Chambéry, France. The Shroud was stored inside a silver reliquary locked behind an iron grill. Silver melts at 1,652 degrees F. One corner of the reliquary had already liquefied when rescuers reached it. Molten silver dripped through the folded cloth, burning 12 large holes. Water used to douse the flames left additional stains. The burn marks are clearly visible today. They frame the body image on both sides, but the image survived. Fire destroys paint, destroys ink, destroys pigment, destroys dye, destroys every known artistic medium. It did not destroy this. Whatever created the image on the Shroud, it isn't any substance fire can consume. It's a rearrangement of the atoms already in the fabric, and it has outlasted molten silver. Now remember Barry Schwartz, our Jewish photographer. 17 years of doubt, the blood that was the wrong color. Here's how it ended. Mid-1995. Schwartz was home in Santa Barbara when the phone rang. On the other end was Dr. Alan Adler, blood chemist, Western Connecticut State University, one of the world's leading experts on porphyrins, the molecular structures at the heart of hemoglobin. Also Jewish, also not interested in proving any Christian relic authentic, Adler had spent years analyzing the blood samples from the 1978 STURP examination, and he had the answer to the one question that had kept Schwartz skeptical for nearly 2 decades. Adler told Schwartz that he had discovered abnormally high concentrations of bilirubin in the Shroud's blood. Bilirubin is a yellow-orange compound produced by the liver when it breaks down red blood cells. Under normal circumstances, it's present in small amounts, but under extreme conditions, prolonged torture, massive physical trauma, sustained terror, the liver floods the bloodstream with bilirubin. It's a stress response, a biochemical scream. And bilirubin does something unusual to blood. It binds to hemoglobin in a way that prevents normal oxidation. Regular blood turns brown and eventually black over time because hemoglobin oxidizes. But blood saturated with bilirubin stays red. Not for years, not for decades, indefinitely. The blood of a tortured man stays red forever. Schwartz described the moment years later. He realized that the last piece of evidence had come in, and he had no choice but to accept that the Shroud was authentic. Every objection he'd held for 17 years collapsed at once. The blood was red not because it was fake, not because it was painted, but because the person it came from had been tortured so severely that his liver chemistry permanently altered the blood's color. He invoked Sherlock Holmes. If you eliminate all the possibilities, whatever remains, however improbable, is most likely the truth. And then he did something remarkable. He accepted the evidence and he didn't convert. Barry Schwartz remained Jewish for the rest of his life. He never accepted Christianity. He never prayed to Jesus. He never set foot in a church as a worshiper. He treated the shroud as evidence, not a religious object. And the evidence, he said, led to one conclusion. The cloth is authentic, whatever that means, whatever implications it carries. On January 21st, 1996, he launched Shroud.com, the world's oldest and largest shroud research archive, 5 years older than Google, visited by over 15 million people from more than 160 countries. In his famous 2013 TEDx talk, delivered of all places at the Vatican, he told the audience, "I truly believe that only God would think to choose a Jewish man who had no emotional attachment to Jesus, who was a total skeptic and with a pretty negative attitude, and put him on that team." Then he paused and smiled and delivered the line that silenced the room. Isn't it funny how God always seems to pick a Jew to be the messenger? I'm the messenger. A Jewish photographer standing at the Vatican telling an audience of believers that the most important relic in their faith was authentic, not because of his faith, but despite his lack of it. Not because he wanted it to be true, but because the evidence left him no room to deny it. Barry Schwartz died on June 21, 2024, age 77, leukemia and kidney failure. He was honored posthumously at the July 2025 International Shroud Conference in St. Louis with a Lifetime Achievement Award. He never wavered and he never converted. A Jewish man who spent 46 years studying the most Christian relic in existence. Broken not by faith, not by theology, not by peer pressure, but by a molecule called bilirubin, a blood chemical that turns invisible torture into a color you can't ignore. Step back with me now. Look at everything we've laid out. 6 independent scientific disciplines. Biology, chemistry, physics, genetics, botany, forensic medicine. None coordinated. Most working decades apart. All converging on the same place and the same time. Jerusalem, 1st century between 30 and 33 CE. An image that predates photography by 8 centuries, that encodes 3-dimensional spatial data no artwork in history has reproduced, that exists on a layer 200 nanometers deep, thinner than a bacterium that survived molten silver, that 34 trillion watts of modern laser technology can't fully replicate. Blood deposited before the image formed. Wrist nailing and retracted thumbs that no artist knew about until modern anatomy. DNA from 5 continents mapping a 2,000-year Silk Road journey. Pollen from a hillside near Jerusalem concentrated around the head. A crown of thorns written in molecules. Stitching found only in fabrics from Masada. A matching face cloth in Spain with documented witnesses including El Cid. And a carbon dating test built on a medieval repair patch, supervised by a man who was rewarded with an endowed chair for the result with raw data, hidden for 30 years and proven statistically incoherent when finally released. I'm not telling you the shroud is authentic. I'm telling you the evidence is not what you were told it was. The case was never closed. It was papered over by a headline that stuck and a correction nobody reported. Somewhere in Turin, behind bulletproof glass, sealed in climate-controlled argon, a piece of linen sits folded in the dark. It carries blood that is still red, an image no one can explain, DNA from civilizations that have come and gone, pollen from a garden near Jerusalem, and the testimony written in molecules, not words, of a death so violent that the body's own chemistry recorded it. It doesn't need you to believe in it. It's been waiting 2,000 years. It can wait a little longer. If this changed how you see the shroud or what settled science really means, we go where the evidence leads, especially when it leads somewhere nobody expected. And let me know in the comments after everything you've just heard. Do you think the Shroud of Turin is real? Or is there an explanation we haven't found yet? I want to hear it because this conversation is far from over.